Thanks so much for joining us here. Really excited about all of these talks. So, subject for our session is role of ET data and streamlined water use measurement and reporting. Lucky to have four really talented panelists here with a lot of, we've heard a little bit about all of these in the morning session. And we'll kick it off with Brett Baker. And I'm going to ask Brett not to talk anything about the Delta. I want to hear the grizzly bear story again. Yeah. So, no. All right. Brett is a I got it wrong. Sixth generation. I was off. In his family to live and grow up on Sutter Island in the California Delta. He's raised on his family's pear orchard and spent much of his youth working in production agriculture. He received his BS degree in fish and wildlife conservation from UC Davis, where he worked at the John Muir Institute of the Environment under Peter Moyle, working on field biology of mountain meadow systems throughout the northern Sierras. From there, he moved to the Heritage and Wild Trout Program and then the California Department of Fish and Game and continued sampling systems throughout the Sierras and the balance of the state. We'll have to swap stories about hiking around high-altitude meadows and doing field biology and collection.
Another conference for that.
Yeah. He was introduced to legislative policy making while working as the agriculture and water policy analyst for Lieutenant Governor John Garamendi, and following passage of the 2009 Delta Reform Act, started Baker Advocacy Consulting, Inc., and began working with family, friends, and neighbors to comply with the newly mandated measuring, monitoring, and reporting regulations for diverters in the Delta. In 2019, you became a member of the California Bar, and you currently practice at Nomalini, Greeley, and McDaniel Law in Stockton, representing Delta Water, the Central Delta Water Agencies, and other clients. So with that, and you play a mean game of blackjack. So I'll let you talk about the work in the Delta.
Thank you, Forrest. Well, I just want to start out and tell you all it's such a pleasure to be here. And the attorney in me wants to disclaim a few things. I can't sing and I can't dance, but I might try. And I also may tear up about this because this has been something that we've been working on for a long time. And yeah, it's so overwhelming to be here and finally put faces and to names and meet all the folks that I've been working with virtually for so long now, and just looking forward to. I wanted to thank them before I forget.
I think this one. Check and see if this one's working. See if your hands free.
Okay. Hello. Okay. And I just wanted to thank. Before I forget, I want to thank obviously Forrest and Robin and Rachel and Matt and Jordan and Jamie and Will and Maurice and Britta. All for their support and help and for doing what they did and like Jay mentioned earlier, it would feel like we're riding on their shoulders. And I also want to thank my lovely wife for making sure I got here, had a tie, didn't miss my plane, all those things like that. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start out with a question here. So who in this room, do we have any surveyors? Maybe you can raise your hand. Anybody is a surveyor? Anybody ever measured stream flow? All right, we might be in the right room here then. Okay, and are there any engineers in this room? Okay, you guys know what it's like to pretend to be attorneys, so we got that in common. Okay, great. So I'm gonna go for the California Delta, give you a little bit of historical context, what it's like measuring things in the Delta, talk about the legislation that got us here, the 2009 Delta Reform Act and SB 88, and then I'll give you a quick overview of our API that we built to help water users in the Delta report their diversion and use. So this is the Delta in a state of nature as depicted by the San Francisco Estuary Institute over there on the far right. You can see all the dendritic channels. It was historically a naturally freshwater marsh or tidal estuary. And then this picture in the middle here is one of the first official maps of the state. I believe it's 1873. That gray area in the middle is the Delta. You can see there's still a Tulare Lake. But that pretty much shows the watershed of what is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is the majority of the state of California. So we all know it all runs downhill and paydays on Friday, but if you, just to oversimplify, if you dropped a bowling ball in Redding, it would roll past my house on Sutter Island, and if you dropped one down there in Fresno or Bakersfield, it would eventually roll out through the Golden Gate as well. There's an artist depiction of what it looked like when they came through. It was a largely unreclaimed, well, it was obviously unreclaimed, it was full of trees and wild vegetative growth. Consumed a great deal of water consumptively, and then made it difficult to transverse and travel through the delta. So we passed the Swamp and Overflow Land Act in 1850. This was for Arkansas and the Everglades and whatnot. But also in California, we had this swampy and overflowed land. So folks went through and they reclaimed this land. There were some rules and requirements. You had to show that you could successfully cultivate it for 3 years and get it surveyed and get a sign off by the commissioners, local land commissioners, that it had been reclaimed and was cultivable. This is a map, also from the 1870s, and you can't quite read it up there, but it's 2 bodies of land notoriously swamp and overflowed. There's a yellow line kind of around the perimeter there, and this tracks very well with what becomes the statutory legal delta later on in 1959. So one of the few things that is unique about the hydrology of the delta, and I'll go back to this picture here, is we're connected to the Pacific Ocean. So that means that, and our channels and a lot of the land in the delta is at or below sea level. Now where I grew up on Sutter Island, and I walk out on my front porch, I'm about 6 feet above sea level, and our land is largely alluvial flow. It's not subsiding peat marsh, but there are portions of the delta that are 20 to 30 feet below sea level, and were natively peat soils, and they're oxidizing and eroding and blown away in the wind continually. So, but the unique thing about the delta is that we always have water. That gave me a kind of a strange perspective, perhaps, because on rivers and geomorphology to begin with, because when I walked out and looked at Steamboat Slough in front of my house, it always had water in it. It sometimes flowed this way and sometimes flowed that way, but it always had water in it. And so that tide comes in and changes twice a day, every day. So importantly in the development of the delta, I want to highlight a few dates. I skipped one here. That was 1914. I was going to try and avoid talking about water rights, but I just don't think we'll be able to. It pains me not to give you a 45-minute dissertation on it, but I'll try and give you like a 30-second drive-by. How about that? So in 1914, we passed the California Water Commission Act. Actually, in 1913, we passed it, but all water appropriated prior to December 19th, 1914 was dealt with in a different set of rules we had, and then everything else after 1914 was regulated by the state. So pre-1914 was kind of between water users themselves. You also hear riparian rights. We did in California adopt the English common law riparianism. We had the appropriative doctrine as well, and then, like I said, we have a statutory appropriation scheme that we use as well. So in 1935, the federal government began to plan and authorize and construct the Central Valley Project. That is one of the largest diversions out of the Delta. In the 50s and 60s, the state began to plan their own project to extract water from the Delta and export it to places of deficiency. In 1959, we passed the Delta Protection Act, which actually defined statutorily the boundaries of the Delta and kind of made us our own standalone, unique area, which is kind of great. Good. It's got good things and bad things. You got to kind of feel like the hunk of stinky cheese, like you're standing alone out there. Like we are actually regulated differently than other water users in the state of California. We have the 2009 Reform Act we passed and created the position of Delta Water Master. As far as I understand, we are the only portion of the state of California that has a water master. So later on, as they began to operate these projects, they said, well, how are we going to operate these? What constraints are we going to define for ourselves? And as I stated earlier, there's always water in the Delta, so it's never a matter of quantity, but it is a matter of quality. So the State Water Resources Control Board defined some water quality standards. They were litigated, because that's what we do in California, is we litigate over water. And there was a Racanelli decision that basically said that the responsibility for maintaining water quality in the delta fell on the projects, and they were required, you can read that if you'd like, I don't want to read from my PowerPoint, but you're required to provide a water supply for delta water users and fish and wildlife. And then in 2009, as I mentioned, we passed the Delta Reform Act. So prior to that, the only reporting of water rights in the Delta really was those of the appropriative under the statutory appropriation scheme. When those projects went online, prudent landowners went and filed prior to them going online and said, hey, I want to put a placeholder here for my water use. And so there were various licenses, we'll call them, in the Delta that were filed, and those were reported on, generally speaking, from the time they were filed until today. In 2009, for the first time, folks had to begin reporting under their senior claims and their riparian and pre-14, their statutory overlying, recycled, reclaimed, even salvage rights were not reported on before. So in 2009, folks went and began registering. They got these statement numbers, and they submit an initial place of use associated with that statement number. So here's the Delta today. I grabbed this off of Esri. As you can see, it's been largely reclaimed. It's been in that state for, by and large, since the early 1900s. That red line there is the statutorily defined boundary of the legal delta. As you can see, there's the 65 islands and tracts that Jay had mentioned in his talk. This one didn't come out that great, and I knew it wasn't going to, but I want to put it in here anyway. This is the Central Delta. This is the agency that I work for. This is the South Delta. This is the North Delta. We don't have it on there. That's the agency I grew up in. But those three agencies were created in the 70s, following some legislation as well. And our two agencies, by and large, picked up the HOD for most Delta water users, and we began to comply with the regulations using an alternative measuring method. And we basically created an Excel spreadsheet using IRTC. We would talk to our farmers, find out what acreages that they were irrigating, what crops they were planting. And then we incorporated localized weather data using CEMA stations to modify the ITRC equation and get use figures. But at the same time, there was the requirement to measure and meter. It had the not locally cost-effective provision you could which allowed you to come up with an alternative method. So with our prior water master, Michael George, we had come to an agreement that we would continue to report our water use based on the spreadsheet and the IRTC, but we would install some meters as well. So my job became to try and keep some meters running. That's a simple eddy weir that we installed, and this is an inline ultrasonic meter. So we continued to meter. We got bad data. We got no data in a lot of places. Had lots of problems with the functioning of these meters. This is a siphon right here. There's no electrical supply at that point, so we had to rely on a solar panel. We created that box. It gets very hot. We had circuit boards fry. We had batteries go bad. So we were missing out on data oftentimes, but we would continue to try and get readings. And we would compare them with our spreadsheet and what we found. Now, I just want to point out a few things here. I did drive my Chevy on the levee because it was dry. And that's a cornfield out there, and that corn has not been irrigated, and it wasn't irrigated, I think this was in the month of like May. It wasn't irrigated till like halfway through June, so the corn was about this high before anybody put irrigation on it. We have continuous seepage through the levees. The water level on the other side of that levee is probably even with about the hood of my truck. So there's a lot of head pressure and water coming through 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. So that's one source of water. And the thing about farming in the Delta is, as I've mentioned, we always have water. Our problem generally is that we have too much water. So these islands and tracts all maintain and operate drainage systems, and they have to do that to aerate the root, to keep the root zone aerated. and have, ideal growing conditions for their crops. It doesn't benefit us to over-irrigate, and any water that we take out, if it's not consumptively used, is either goes back into the channel through the discharge, percolates back into the groundwater, or even creeps back into the channel and accretes to the channel. There's nowhere for us to put it or store it. So consumptive use is the relevant measure in the Delta and has been since the projects went online. And consumptive use was calculated using a clunky old equation from 1960s. And for, this is how clunky it was. Precipitation, if it rained at Fire Station 3 in Stockton, that precipitation was extrapolated across the entire Delta for 3 days. So it was kind of, we knew it was bad, but that's what we could all agree on, at least from the beginning of the operation of the projects, that the relevant measure in the Delta was consumptive use. All right, so and the other thing, on this very spot, not at this very day, but when replacing a circuit board, I think I'm pretty sure I got down on my hands and knees and began looking upward and praying that somebody out there could help us come up with a better solution to do this. And about that time, Michael George began speaking to me about OpenET. We contacted Forrest and Co. We came up with an idea. Jamie Harding at Habitat 7 helped us build a wireframe, a framework of what we wanted to do, how we wanted to build our website, how we wanted it to function, what we wanted it to look like. So first things first, we had to map out all of these places of use in the Delta and associate them with the points of diversion that provided water to them. So we got an Esri account and started mapping. And I started in the Central Delta Water Agency, and that's our current map that's our current geodatabase that we have today. And as you can see, it covers the majority of the Delta. This is our website. You saw this earlier in Jay's talk. I'll just walk you through how it works. That's my little slice of heaven right there. That's the pear farm I grew up on. So the user signs in, logs in, says, that's my place of use. That's correct, that's me. So then they go, and it takes them to the report that they're gonna file. What we did is we fixed all the figures, what Will and Jordan in the back of the room here did, is they fixed all the figures that came out of OpenET. So the API queries OpenET, gets data inside the Polygon, consumptive use data for the 12 months out of the year, and then it populates them in this form here. And so one of the problems with our spreadsheet was that if a farmer wanted to, he could modify the numbers, change the numbers, not put numbers in on months, years, in years where he didn't irrigate, months of the year when he didn't irrigate. And it was just a little loosey-goosey. Having said that, the regulations when they first came out were pretty loosey-goosey themselves. And so you got this great variability in data, right? People would report in gallons per minute, acre feet, or cubic feet per second. The data was all over the place. And the methods for complying with the regulation themselves were all over the place. You could use electrical records. You could use even a bucket and a stopwatch, I'm not making that up, to calculate your diversion rate, which makes sense if done correctly. So then we got these figures in here, and the person puts in their name, their contact information, and files the report. And all in all, it takes about 5 minutes to file a report. It used to take hours. You had to contact folks, make assumptions, and this way there's no crop types involved, there's really nothing for anybody to mess up. So we get this uniform data set at the end, which is wonderful. And so we're looking forward to hopefully the more uniform data. We believe that it is more relevant data as opposed to metering the diversion and only measuring what comes through the pipe, because that's not the whole picture. Like I said, we have groundwater, artesian flows, seepage, all kinds of different sources of water that are beneficially used. And we want to make beneficial use of them to the maximum extent possible. The other benefit we think is this is more timely data. We can turn around in about 6 weeks and get consumptive use data, and it's verifiable. So that is to say that we could trace it back to the source as opposed to Farmer John fudging some numbers in a spreadsheet somewhere. So what we're and when we talk about this in the Delta, people are like, what do you what's your big accomplishment here? Well, as Jay said, we did spatially define some of these places of use. For my water users, we avoided the installation of those meters. That's extremely cost prohibitive for them, as long as an ongoing maintenance cost. And then, so we're hopeful that we got those things out of it. What we're hopeful that this data can do is result in more informed decision making from those who regulate us at the state board. We're hoping that this can result in increased accountability for the state and federal projects that take large amounts of water out of the Delta, that OpenET can be used elsewhere in the state of California to, kind of benchmark what our water consumption is. And hopefully, we can elicit desirable outcomes to benefit legal users of water and public trust resources like fish and wildlife, which I'm sure you may or may not be aware of, are very much in peril in the Delta. I just want to add one last issue. This is a dog killing chickens over here. So I was kind of talking about being singled out in this hunk of stinky cheese in the Delta. We are kind of looked at both upstream and downstream as a little odd. And we're the chickens, and they're the dogs, and they would like us to go away. So you may also read about a major infrastructure project that's been contemplated since 2009. It's gone through various renditions, but that is to build a tunnel to take water out of the Sacramento River and take it through the Delta without freshening the Delta and put it in those export projects. And so that's kind of like the background drumbeat of all of what's going on here. And so we hope that this will give folks a more accurate accounting of what's going on in the Delta, and we hope to avoid the construction of that monstrosity of a mega project that is fraught with peril and all kinds of other things. So anyhow, on that note, I think I'm done.
We'll see if there's a question or two for
Sure.
any questions.
Any questions?
Just a quick clarification, what you said about it, you think that this program will help avoid the installation of meters. Did you mean farmers and that mandate whereby they have the telemetry data from meters that could be avoided as a result?
Well, I mean, as Jay mentioned in his talk, it would cost around a rough estimate, who knows, $29 million to install a physical measuring device on each of the 1,300 or 2,300 diversions in the Delta. So, and that cost would be borne by the farmers themselves. That's not to mention the ongoing cost of operation and maintenance. The amount of time I spent on the side of that levee, the reason I ended up on my hands and knees praying or looking up to the sky was that they just don't work perfectly, and they don't work perfectly. And we all know that. We got phones in our pockets that don't work perfectly. We got laptop computers that don't work perfectly. It's just another piece of technology, and it's not fail-safe. And this allows for us to get the data that is relevant. When we first got this mandate, we said, how is this data going to be used? And fortunately, it's not going to be used to our benefit. It's going to be used to curtail folks. It's going to be used to maybe enforce against folks for using water unreasonably or whatever it might be. So we were glad that we could continue focusing on the relevant thing, consumptive use, instead of going down this financial rat hole of trying to get a perfect measure on how much water comes through a pipe, which is not even really relevant in our situation and scenario. So.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the original regulation was going to require installation of meters, but allowed for an alternative plan of compliance, right? And so then through OpenET, we were able to meet the standards necessary for the alternative compliance plan, and thanks to the work by Michael George and then continued by Jay Ziegler, have been able to implement this program. So
Yeah, and the one thing I'll say is what originally when Michael came to me, he said, "We have a math problem, Brett." So what's the math problem? He said, "Well, we have these licenses, and folks, and that the nature of the licenses are that you use it or lose it, right? The riparian right cannot be lost by non-use, and it's not quantified. So we had these folks that would put all their water use under their license because they didn't want to lose it, and then they'd also put it under their statement. So you had this duplicative reporting, and so that was one of the main tenets of what we were trying to accomplish. Is we were trying to not duplicate the data, and as a side benefit, we got cleaner data, we got more useful data, we get more relevant data, but we didn't want to be double counting water and blowing up the demand in the delta to something unreasonable. When it came down to times of shortage and they wanted to regulate folks, they could creep further upstream and steal more natural flow out of the system because they overestimated how much we were using.